Good afternoon, everybody. Out of curiosity, is there anyone who was not here for my Rainbow Talk yesterday and has no clue beyond that introduction who I am? Okay, good. We only had 2 people with blind faith yesterday. The rest of you know what you're in for. So I'll skip the who's this guy. We've got that part covered. I want to talk about how I got to this point where some weirdo on the internet is babbling about plants. As kind of mentioned, my family's been into aquatics all the way back to my great-grandmother in the 50s and 60s. For me personally, I was really into fish as a kid, but never could keep plants alive. Now granted, I was mostly in the 80s and early 90s. Tech's gotten a lot better, our knowledge has gotten a lot better. I came back to this hobby in 2016, really wanted to do planet tanks, saw some planet tanks on YouTube. That's what brought me in, and well, I never go into any given hobby easily. My local aquarium society, the Greater Seattle Aquarium Society, I found out about them through going to some local fish stores, and they were having a picnic where there was going to be a plant swap. And I said, okay, I have to be a member? That'll get me to join your club. I'll go to this random picnic in the middle of July. And then 4 days later, I did my first fish-related YouTube video. We get to October of that same year, 2017, and you can see here, this is my first set of plant entries into our horticulture awards program. Should be kind of obvious by the fact that there's several different species. I don't start anything lightly. I don't know how to take it easy or be controlled. By January of 2018, I had achieved my first Master Aquatic Horticulturalist. The average person in the Greater Seattle Aquarium Society takes about a year to get their first one, and fairly dedicated hobbyists do it in about 6 months. Yeah, I did it in 3. By April of 2018, I had achieved Master 2. Then I started doing what I call Plants for Profit series, because I firmly believe if you're very good at plants, or at least convince yourself that you're good at plants, you can actually make more money more efficiently selling plants if you have a healthy planted tank group in your area, which thankfully the Northwest is psychotic about plants. It's too dreary outside. We need to bring nature inside to feel better about ourselves. And then from there, you can see Master 3 in May of 2018. And then by the time we get to October of 2021, I had finished Master Aquatic Horticulturalist 10 times. At this point, if I were to go back and start submitting again, I just kind of took a break because there's such a massive gap between me and like second place in my club that I kind of feel bad. So I took a break, but by now I'd actually probably be closer to about Master 15. I've grown way too many plants, and I stopped keeping track actively 2 years ago, just because at a certain point, it's more about doing it for myself than any other kind of recognition. Let's get into this talk, which is finding balance. One of the biggest problems I think a lot of people run into is losing sight of this statement: focus on the plant's needs. Very often we will hear about like, oh, you need to fertilize with this often, or you need this much light, or blah, blah, blah. Forget almost all of that and start here at the plant itself, or the plants you select in any given aquarium. It'll make your life a lot easier, and I'm going to show you how. I'm going to walk you through my steps. Most of you who have done planted tanks, you know this is like a giant puzzle. Trying to find balance can be kind of a nightmare if you try to look at the whole picture at once. But if we break the pieces apart, water, light, substrate, carbon, and then your 2 types of nutrients, macros and micros. If we break them up and look at the pieces individually and figure out how they connect, this gets way, way easier. Because trust me, I have like a black thumb naturally. I could not keep a terrestrial plant to save my soul. My mother is a fantastic gardener. I kill almost everything if it is not good and healthy where it is, and I basically only have to water it. But somehow, this guy who's terrible at plants in a garden figured out how to do plants underwater. So if I can do it, you can too. So I'm going to very briefly go under water. One of my favorite things to tell people is understanding your water is one of the best things you can do for any given aquarium, whether it's about your fish or your plants. we've got all these fancy things, right? pH, hardness, ammonia, nitrite, nitrate. We can break them down simply, right? The things that really actually matter the most when we're talking about plants come into your different hardnesses. You have general hardness, which is basically the calcium and magnesium content of your water, so some of your mineral content. Then you have carbonate hardness. Carbonate hardness, really all that says is, will your pH remain stable? Carbonate hardness is the natural buffer that keeps our pH in place. I'm from Seattle. Our water has almost no carbonate hardness and is very, very soft. So if we don't use a buffer of some form, whether it's like crushed coral or you could use chemical buffers, whatever that may be, 24 hours after you put water in a tank, your pH goes from 7.2 to 7.4 to 6. It just crashes off the face of the planet, and it can go lower. I've had mine drop all the way down to 5 in a 24-hour period from 7.4 because there's no carbonate hardness to keep it stable. In general, for most planted tanks, plants typically like slightly softer water. Does that mean you always have to have soft water? Absolutely not. Any of you who are from the Midwest and live in liquid rock but have planted tanks know you can have high hardness and still have plants do well. But in general, the kind of optimal ranges, big quotation marks around that, is about 4 degrees of hardness, which tips you into about 70 ppm of either GH or KH. So if you're anything above that, don't go panicking, that's fine. You just kind of want to be at that minimum because that helps keep you at a baseline level of stability. So if you happen to be, many say, fortunate to have really crazy, easy to work with water like mine where there's nothing in it and you can do whatever you want to it, you want to try and bring it up to a little bit of a baseline. Crushed coral, things like that are easy peasy ways to do it. Here's my real lesson about water. When you know your water, it makes adjusting your fertilization easier. And my example would be this. If you naturally have well water that has nitrates coming out of it to start, you probably don't need to dose high levels of nitrogen. Every time you're doing a water change, you're adding nitrates to the water. You don't need even more beyond that. If you're in Seattle and you have nothing, you have to add everything. If you're one of the lucky few who somehow has potassium in your water, which is like one of the most rare things to find is potassium in water, Java Fern will be your best friend known to man. Anybody else who likes Java Fern, you're dosing extra potassium to keep that stuff healthy. But when you know your water really well, when you have to diagnose problems, it gets super easy to start narrowing in on where the problems are because you know your baseline from your water. The other thing is, if you're in really hard water, don't select the plants that have to be in soft water. Don't fight your water. And similarly, if you have super soft water, don't go, you know, that Monte Carlo looks really nice. For those that don't know, Monte Carlo is like a calcium hog. So it loves high levels of GH because there's lots of calcium present. Monte Carlo hates me because I have no calcium in my water, and I typically don't add a lot of calcium to my water because I keep a lot of fish that tend to like some but not a ton of mineral content. And again, kind of reiterating it because I feel it's important. Don't fight your water. Make it easy on yourself to start. When you start getting the basics really well down, then you can go crazy and be like, I'm going to turn my liquid rock into RO, I'm going to remineralize it, and I'm going to try that Syngonanthus species that likes its ridiculously soft water. But until you get used to the basics, don't hurt yourself. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. Start easy. Make it simple. Work with your water. Your plants will work with you. This is a fantastic graphic that Aquarium Gardens made. It's about the balance between micro, macro, and light. And I want to break it down even more than just this graphic does, because this is one of the most important balances we can find when we're talking about our planted tanks. There's 2 graphs that you can find easily in a simple Google search by simply searching aquarium, mineral, deficiency, plant. 4 terms, doesn't even make a coherent sentence. But the first one will give you this one, right? This is all your macros. Macros are really simple. Those are the things that your plants need the most of. Carbon being the number 1, but we'll talk about carbon more in depth in a second. Nitrogen, potassium, phosphate, these are your big boys, right? So for those who like to do like EI dosing, where everything's a little powder and it's all separated and you do all this crazy nonsense, I don't, I'm too lazy. You'll know like K, NO3, PO4, blah, blah, blah. I'm not a scientist. I don't go that deep. I don't memorize them that way. I just go by the brain dead version. Calcium, potassium, nitrogen, right? I'm simple. Macros make up a majority of like your fertilizer. So if you're in an all-in-one, whether it's a liquid or root tab, something like that, 90% of them are your macros. Then the second chart that's your best friend is this bad boy, which is your deficiency of micronutrients. Micro opposite of macro. You need very little of these, but each one is really important because they play a lot of like fun chemistry balancing things inside your plants of how their internal structures function. I won't get over that. That's not the stuff we need to know. All we need to know is these are your trace elements. So this is sometimes considered sulfur, calcium, magnesium, but the most important ones are your iron, your manganese, surprisingly chlorine, copper, boron, molybdenum, that's a fun one, cobalt, and nickel. Very rarely do you find all of your micros in individual things. Think about your products like Flourish Trace. If you're like me and you're a fan of like Brightwell stuff, there's their Florin Multi. Most of the time, all your traces are in together and they're made simply. One of the most common problems that we run into typically just involves not enough trace minerals. So if you start seeing little holes or a this or a, like the lower section of my plant's not doing as well, almost always my go-to is to go just add a little touch of Flourish Trace or one of those trace minerals, because very frequently it means that there's something of that missing, and adding extra of those as opposed to your macros, so like your nitrogen especially, almost never will cause algae issues within your tank. It is relatively easy to dose extra micros with, effectively speaking, zero negative consequences. So never be afraid to just splash in a little extra micros. It's one of the most simple, easy ways to solve problems without actually understanding the problem. I did this for like a year and a half. My crutch was just Flourish Trace constantly. I hate to admit that and make it sound like I actually know what I'm doing. Seriously, a year and a half of me growing plants was like, that's not doing so well. All right, wait a couple days. The week left, 2 weeks later, everything starts looking good again. Now, I'll briefly talk about fertilization methods, because in the end, all that matters is that you're delivering nutrients to plants the way they want them. Root feeders, at the roots. Epiphytes, stems, they're water column feeders, right? So they want stuff up in the water column. You can cheat by having really good substrate. Think of your aqua soils, dirt for those of you who are the type of crazy like a dirted tank. I've had nightmare scenarios, so I'm just scarred for life and probably will never go back. But I know plenty of people that have success, so I'm certainly not saying it's impossible. But you have like your all-in-ones. Think your Easy Green, Tropica, Dustin's Grow Juice, Nylock G. There's like thousands of these things, right? Everybody and their mother has got their own fertilizer blend, and they're all basically the same. So whether you are me and you live near aquarium co-op, so you just buy their stuff because it's simple, or whether you buy stuff on Amazon, as long as it has all of your macros and your micros in one, treat them all identical. They probably have a dosing instruction that is usually like 1 pump per 10 gallons. Because once one person does it, everybody follows because it's easy. And for those of us who start dumb but think we're smarter than we are, thanks. This just makes it simple for us, right? Root tabs, obvious, right? I mean, I have some here that if you pay enough attention, I'll be giving some away later. These, if you love crypts, if you love nymphaea, these are your best friend. You love swords, these are definitely the best friend, because swords are crazy hungry at their roots. And they function just like an all-in-one. The only difference is they're a little capsule or a nugget or some kind of disc, whatever it may be. There's a bunch of different forms that you just plug in as opposed to squirt liquid into the tank. Same function, just different delivery mechanism. Then you have like your estimated index dosing, and you can also have what's called the lean method is the other way to think about this, where you're splitting things apart. Whether you're trying to do like the full C-Chem flourish, I don't know if you folks have ever seen like the full C-Chem flourish dosing. I've ranted about it in a video in the past because I think it's insane to ask people to do that. But like EI is very similar, where it's like, okay, well, you need this powder on this day and then this powder on this day, and now you go back to this powder plus this powder. You got to do this one once a week, and it's for the true crazies, like your Tom Bars of life, who really, really know what they're doing and not like pseudo know what they're doing. That's where EI can come in, and especially if you have some very interesting water parameters, EI can be really awesome because you can tailor your fertilization method to perfectly marry up with your water and the plants that you're using. So for those who like are truly meticulous in life, EI is probably your best friend. And then there's what's called the lean dosing, where you typically split your macros and your micros apart and you feed them on alternate days. I kind of lump that in with EI because it's a little extra complicated. If you're having more complicated plants, do you need those complicated methods? Absolutely not. No, you do not. I'm living proof. I use all-in-one liquid fertilizers and occasionally remember I should put root tabs in for some of my plants. I do it as dumb as possible, but let me show you why. Okay, Mr. Plant Guy, why? I like choosing fertilizers based on my plants. So if I'm trying to do lots of epiphytes or stems, I never worry about root tabs. If I have a lot of crypts and swords and nymphaeas, all these things that build huge, robust root structures and get about 80% of their nutrients by root feeding, I don't worry about liquid fertilizer. I just use root tabs. If you mix the two, the cheater methodology is to have a decent substrate that will pull some of those nutrients out of the water for your root feeders, and then just pick whatever is easiest for you to dose. Make it easy on yourself. Like I said, I go with the brain dead easy way. I go simple, all in one. I don't tailor anything. The most I tailor is like, those Java Fern in that tank that is 90% Java Fern, starting to look not perfect. Micros that have potassium. Done. I do this as simple as possible, because when you complicate things too much, it is easy to make mistakes. Simplicity gives you protection. You can get very, very far with plants by doing it kind of like an idiot. But here's the one thing that I will say. I cheat on the lean dosing method. My favorite way to dose fertilizer is like this. If I have a 40-gallon breeder, and it's all low-tech plants, Anubiases, Java Ferns, low demand, slower growth, don't need very high light. Your typical all-in-one would say, okay, you dose 1 pump per 10 gallons once a week, right? If you were at medium light, it might say, or you add CO2, it might say twice a week. I just take that number and I spread it out over the week. So my example would be, in that case, every other day, 1 pump. That keeps me at a lean level of nutrition constantly available for the plants, instead of, okay, water change, big spike of nutrients, slow taper off, big spike, slow taper off. And the reason why I do that is simple. By keeping a lean level of nutrition that's available constantly for my plants, they're always photosynthesizing, they're always fighting algae. Big spikes are more likely to cause algae outbreaks, because you'll have a point where the plants will stop having what they need, and imbalance is more likely to occur. If you constantly have a light amount of what your plants need, they will constantly consume it, and you're less likely to have issues where your phosphate gets out of control, or you have too much light for the amount of nutrients you have, whatever that may be. Spreading things out and making it simple really, really takes a lot of pressure off of this. And that's one of my biggest pieces of advice I can give you is, no matter what they tell you on the fertilizer package, if they tell you only dose it twice a week, just do the math real fast and go, well, that's 8 pumps on my 40-gallon breeder total in a week. Okay, so I do 1 pump a day, but on the day I water change, I do 2. Easy, right? If you water change once a week, makes it easy. Make things simple and balance becomes easy. This is a real fun chart. I want you to pay attention to this thing. And for those of you who've ever seen Idiocracy, it's one of my favorite movies. I quote it in a lot of dumb things in dumb ways. This is a thing from that. It's what plants crave, and I love the joke of that. But you'll notice here's your micros and macros, right? Notice this bad boy. 79% carbon. Of all the things plants need, it's carbon. Just like you and I, when we eat food, we're eating carbon. When we dose things to plants, they need carbon. But our fertilizers and that nefarious liquid carbon stuff are not the carbon they really want. They want gaseous carbon that's dissolved in the water systems. That usually means turbulence at your top of your tank because you get gas exchange, or respiration from your fish, or, of course, hooking one of these bad boys up to your tank and injecting CO2. Now, there's a talk a little later today from Kelly Foreman about doing CO2. I won't go super in depth because she's awesome at CO2, and I would highly encourage you to go to her talk. But we'll do this very briefly. Liquid carbons. This is typically glutaraldehyde. Okay, so like easy carbon, flourish carbon, anything that says carbon on it that's a liquid, that's an algicide. It's really good at negating algae, especially things like staghorn and blackbeard. It is abysmal at providing an actually relevant carbon source to your plants. The math on it is something like 1% utilization for plants. So it's never a true carbon source. So anytime that somebody tells you that, it's marketing. This is an algicide, and that's what it's best at. Now, there are ways to get CO2. Injected CO2, the most common thing, right? Got a regulator, you're hooked up to a tank, you're pushing gas into your tank, all the usual stuff that we see in every aquascape tank known to man where there's just bubbles flying at 1,000,000 miles a second. You don't need that. You can do CO2 a much simpler way. Now, there's a couple different versions. You have like your DIY stuff, which is like people do like yeast colonies. Those are really inconsistent. I generally don't recommend them, but if you love a science experiment, have at it. You can also get like the citric acid and baking soda chemical formulas. These are really common as an intro or cheap way to get into CO2. You just have to keep recharging the tank with your citric acid and baking soda. Remember the dumb volcano experiment when we were all in grade school? It's the same thing, right? It's just releasing a bunch of CO2 gas. These can work pretty well, but in general, I would say you're better off spending the slightly extra money and finding something like this CO2 art regulator is a really good one. There's things like the Aquarium Co-op one that are all about $100 or so, and get yourself like a 10-pound tank, 20-pound tank, depending on what you have in your area. If you got a welding supply, local brewery places, you can get these fairly easily. And then refilling them is few and far between if you do one thing. This is my biggest suggestion on CO2. My method. Oh, I forgot that in there. Whatever. It's fine. I do what I call the American barbecue method for CO2. Low and slow. If I have a 40-gallon tank, I'm at no more than 2 bubbles a second. And only on my attempts at aquascaping, which I'm terrible at. I have to have my wife help me because she's the artistic one. Then I go 3. Whew, I know, crazy. 140-gallon tank, 3 bubbles a second. You really don't need a lot of carbon injected into your tank to get just enough boost in the density and color intensity of your plants to keep it also manageable, but have impact. You need so little because that little kick will take you from a negligible amount, something that's like 5 parts per million to 10 parts per million, up into that 15 to 20. You'll see all your like drop checkers and things like that, all the extra equipment that people use, I use none of it. Because it's looking at optimal, and optimal is not necessary. Unless you want to trim your stems every week, then by all means, crank that gas all the way up, but now you have risks potentially of not having enough oxygen in your tank, and you might gas your fish. And as someone who has had a roommate with a 4-year-old daughter who thought that that little dial on your CO2 tank looked like a fun toy, and you see thousands of dollars of rainbowfish in your big display tank gasping at the surface, and you go, what the f? And you do a 90% water change out of a sheer panic emergency, you learn that, one, you hide that regulator so that the small child can't get to it ever again, and two, high gas comes with a risk. Take it low, take it easy, don't make it hard on yourself. Make it manageable, but just get just that little touch to get slightly better plant density, slightly better color, slightly better health. Makes it easier. Easy. I do it dumb. Make it easy. It's the KISS method, right? Keep it simple, stupid. It's my style. Now we'll talk about light really briefly. Modern LED lights, almost all of them are pretty good and pretty powerful. It's not the early stages, and it's not like fluorescent tubes where you need to pay attention to like watts per gallon and this. Ignore those old rules. They don't matter. All that really matters is you want something that's full spectrum, and all that means is there is a spectrum of light that plants can use. PAR. We'll hear PAR all the time, and we'll use PAR as a way to tell us the intensity of light. But what PAR actually is the photosynthetic active radiation, aka the range in the bandwidth of light that plants can use. But we use it as a measuring tool, and it's kind of just common parlance as opposed to what we're actually measuring. Some people like to get super nerdy about that. I don't. I'm simple. If it's not obvious by the fact that I keep dumb rainbow fish, I like to do things as dumb as possible because it makes my life easy. Red and green, actually your best friends. You'll see a lot of lights that have like really high amounts of blue, and you'll probably see things that tell you that like, oh, plants use blue light really efficiently. Do you know it uses blue light way more efficiently than a plant? Algae, thank you. So if you do have something that's controllable, kill your blue light way down, you're less likely to have algae outbreaks. Red light is really good for getting your plants to flower and getting them to grow a touch taller. Green plays this perfect middle ground between blue and red. And despite the fact that all of our entry science, for those of us with no degree, would tell us, well, the plant's green, so doesn't it reflect green light? Yes, but it also absorbs green light, because if you look at your aquatic plants, if you look at a leaf, notice how it's faintly transparent? It needs to be, because it needs the light to go through it, all those fun photons and all that fun sciencey stuff that's way too smart for me, so that the chlorophyll can absorb it and utilize it. Green light has been, in a number of scientific studies, proven to be one of the most effective spectrum of lights for plant growth. But really all you need is white. White is everything. It gives you everything a plant needs. You don't have to go crazy. You don't need pink LEDs and teal and purple and fuchsia and magenta, mauve, whatever. You don't need any of that nonsense. You can have a light that's just white. You can have it with a few extra things. You can go fancy like the Fluval 3.0, one of my favorite lights out there. You can go super fancy and get yourself like a Chihiros or the like death burn radiation that is a UNS Titan that puts out a ludicrous amount of light. You really don't need those things, but they're all surprisingly good these days, even the cheap Chinese ones. Your Heigers, I've used a light called a JCMP, some of your like lower tier Phoenixes, they all work great. Find the one that works best for you. If you're a psycho that really likes to control things, you probably find one that has an app. If you just care about it going on and off, don't worry about that nonsense. Make it easy on yourself. But more importantly, control how long it's on. Timers are your best friend. Don't be, I wake up, I turn my lights on. Just find a, whether it's a mechanical timer, those big chonky things that all of us know from like the 80s, the 70s going back, or more modern, you've got your Wi-Fi timers like the Casas and things like that. Find something so that your light is consistent. Just like your fertilizer where I say spread it out, make it consistent. Just like your carbon where I say low, simple, consistent, make your light consistent. It'll make your life way easier. 6 to 8 hours a day, perfect. You do not have to be a psycho like me who likes their light on 13 hours a day on their tank. Do that when you think you're good at plants, and then you can drive yourself nuts going 13, 14 hours a day on your tanks because you keep rainbowfish and they love that nonsense. Here's the real lessons.
Quick question on
Yeah, go for it.
Can you, like I like to be able to see my fish.
Yep.
So I can see them in the morning before they work, and I can see them at night when I
Yeah.
get home. Can I split my lighting? Is that
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's like a lighting kind of tactic called the siesta, where you have your lights on for a few hours, then while you're at work, you turn them off for a period of time. This actually can be really effective for letting ambient CO2 build up in your tank if you're not injecting CO2, because when lights are off, right, we're no longer consuming CO2 with our plants. They're actually consuming oxygen, and you're still having respiration from your fish. So if you don't want to inject CO2, siestas can be actually a really nice way to help get a little boost of gas in your tank so that when those lights come back on, your plants can kick back into a kind of higher gear of photosynthesis and be chewing up a bit more. Perfectly fine to do that. Just make sure that if your fish are skittish, you have something that can ramp up and ramp down when you turn it on and off. And timers are your best friend. Again, making it consistent is your best friend. So if you're going to do a siesta and it's going to be 4 hours every day or it's going to be 6 hours every day, make sure it's at the exact same time for the exact same duration. It's your best friend. So the real lesson, again, go back to your plants. If you have easy plants, like when you buy a tropical plant and they have that color system, green, idiot, yellow, you think you know what you're doing, red, you actually know what you're doing, aka not me, follow those. Very frequently what those mean are actually the intensity of light they end up needing. Very rarely are your easy plants high light plants. They pseudo-design those systems more based on light needs than anything else because they look at the demand of the plant, and almost always demand is directly tied to light. So if you have Anubias and Java Fern and Ludwigias, you don't need a crazy powerful light. You're probably better off having 8 hours of light at 50% power on your light than you are having it at 100% for 4 hours. Very frequently, photo period is more important to keep consistent, and depowering a light where possible is more of a help. If you have controllable dimmable lights, this is why I live my life by controllable lights. If it's just on off, I probably hate that light, because when problems arise, especially algae, one of your best weapons is just to lower the intensity of the light, but leave it on for as long as it's been on. It is much easier to dim a light and fix a problem than it is to keep chopping the time the light is on off, because you're more likely to negatively impact your plants than the algae by continuously chopping time away. Most of your plants actually need at least 4 hours of light a day, and preferably 6 to 8. Because if you think about it, when they're out in nature, right, their height and growth seasons, they're getting light for 16 hours a day. Spring, summer, right, you're getting lots of light. Winter, right, that's the only time where we see more limited amounts of light. So we need to think kind of like the plant. It's like Eric Bogrock will always say, be the fish. In our case, being the plant. That's our best friend. Adding CO2, wrong button, that one. Adding CO2 allows you to increase your light because it increases the amount of carbon available, and thus the plant can photosynthesize more. So usually it can handle more intense light before algae starts getting out of control. So if you're injecting CO2, your low light plants can probably handle more medium light. So if you were at 50%, you can probably go to 65 or 70 as an example, right? You don't need to go all the way to 100, but you can have a little bit more, and that allows you to bring in some slightly more demanding plants too if you want to challenge yourself. If you want to flower, kind of mentioned earlier, red light's your best friend. If you want to get into spring and you want plants to start flowering, you want to see Anubias flowers, boost flowers, some of your stems that start growing out of your tank, you want to see them flower. Aponagitans love to flower in the spring. Little extra red light, it's like magic. That's like the berry white for your plants. It's the red lights, baby, we're going to show off, all right? Green light, more effective than you think. And finally, one thing that I would say might be the best investment you can possibly make for plant and tank, investing in the control of that light is your best friend. Whether that is a timer, just to keep your light consistent, or investing in a slightly nicer light that you can control the intensity on. And it doesn't have to be fancy. You don't need a fancy app. It can be as simple as an inline controller like the Aquarium Co-op has on theirs. Higer has that on a bunch of theirs. Just something where they have intensity settings. It's your best friend for making things easier on yourself. If you're starting a tank brand new, you don't need to be at max light. Bring your light down some. Make it less likely for your algae outbreaks to occur early. Life's easy. Control your light. So your best friends. Secret.
Mr. Finley?
Okay.
I have shop lights
Yeah.
on my tanks.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way to adjust the intensity would be to raise the light or lower the light closer to the tank.
That's a way, yes.
Yeah. What would be like a usable, like, in order to, like, okay, I need less, like, what increment would you recommend to, like, move it up or down to, like,
Sure.
make a usable difference?
Go an inch at a time. So if you're 3 inches off your tank, take them up an inch to 4.
Okay.
The other thing you could look at doing,
How do I wait for a result?
I typically watch my tank for at least 2 weeks
Okay.
whenever I make an adjustment.
Okay.
The other thing you can do, this is kind of like tricking yourself in a way, is any of those like window clings that diffuse your light, so you can get like those white kind of misty things that give you like the frosted glass look, slap it over the top. Now you're diffusing your light. So if you have really intense light and most of your tank is like a Nubius, which needs very little light in the grand scheme of things, slap one of those things over the top and all of a sudden you've diffused that light down, but you're still getting enough. And there's lots of different transparency levels, so start simple. Most of that stuff's pretty cheap, easily available at hardware stores and Amazon, stuff like that. When you do deal with more lighting that's not necessarily designed for an aquarium, so like grow lights is another thing I get lots of questions on. You can find ways to just put screens in front of them to help diffuse that light down some to make it less intense. Mm-hmm. I mention this a lot, but only be as complex as you're willing to work with. Simplify things. If you don't want to do estimated index and figure out the math on every little individual thing, don't do it. But if you feed your fish once a day, you can also take that extra second to put in that little squirt of fertilizer and spread out your fertilizer, right? That's the most complication I would suggest. Do things based on it. So it's similar to like, how many fish can I fit in my aquarium? How much maintenance are you willing to do? Can you fit 100 tetras in a 20-gallon? Yeah. Can you keep up with the water conditions? Can you filter and maintain that filter enough so that things don't get out of whack? It's the same thing for the plants. Only put yourself on a regime that you're willing to actually do long term. You might tell yourself for those first couple weeks, yeah, I don't mind trimming and rescaping my tank every week. But then if you're like me and you've got 20 tanks, you quickly realize you cannot do that every week. Chill out, make it sustainable. All-in-ones can make things easy. And there are ways to adapt them to be as complex as you want. Like I said, all of us, you can magically create the lean dosing method by spreading the fertilizer out instead of doing it only twice a week or once a week. You can recreate more complex methods with the simplest fertilizer possible. You want to have like super big, robust swords? Jam root tabs under those things every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. And pretty soon your Amazon sword will go from this to that monster that takes up a 30 or 75 gallon. Those things can get huge. And it's all about just adapting the simple method to be slightly more complex. And I put that in big quotation marks because it's really not more complex. It's just spreading it out and being mindful of it, just like how we would feed fish, right? Root tabs absolutely have their place. All-in-ones are simple and easy, but if you have a tank that is 50% crypts, root tabs are probably your friend. Also, one of my big secrets, I put these in quotation marks because I talk about them enough, they shouldn't be a secret. When I start a tank, even if I don't have heavy root feeders and I'm doing more stem-oriented plants, I'll put in a few root tabs under the stems because it helps encourage them to build their initial root systems really robust. And even though stems get 90% of their nutrition or so from the water column, if they have a very healthy stem system, it is unlikely that you're going to run into problems with that plant long term, unless you just completely neglect doing any level of fertilization and maintenance. Low and slow. CO2. If you want to go CO2, make it easy on yourself. You don't need a lot. Can you have a lot? Oh yeah. I've seen some people that put in more gas than I ever thought you possibly could. But they also have those crazy nonsensical ADA tanks, and they spend like $10,000 on a 40-gallon tank. And I'm not about that. I'm doing okay, but I ain't doing that okay, you know? I like my rimmed 40-gallon breeders because they're cheap and they have a nice footprint. I have no fear of putting in a visible little simple diffuser in my tank if I'm doing CO2 because they're inexpensive and they work, right? If you're doing CO2, if you want to try CO2, start easy. Start low and slow. Treat that thing like a good-fashioned Texas brisket. Time. Let it just do its thing over time. Don't rush it. You could say the same thing about everything in aquatics. Be patient. Treat CO2 the same way. Make it easy. Be patient.
Making me hungry talking about all these briskets. Come on.
I got this way for a reason. All right? I love me some good food. Finally, this is slightly more advanced, but at the same time, you can dumb it down. Your plants will tell you everything you need to know. If you have a nutrient deficiency that's starting to happen, you will see it in the leaves of your plants. You will see it in the way that they grow, in the way that they curl, in the way that the pinholes come. That green plant starts to turn yellow on the edges. Those charts that I showed you earlier, they're your best friend to get exactly what deficiency it is. But when you start to see those things, it tells you, oh, go look at that chart. Because 90% of the time, I do the same thing. Unless it's one of the ones that I know the most, pinholes in a leaf is potassium. A leaf curling is calcium. I don't know the rest. I don't have it memorized. But those charts are my best friend. When I see a problem, I just go get that dumb thing on my phone. All right. Oh, yep, low on manganese. Oh, go get my trace elements. There we go. Make it simple on yourself. Use the charts, look at your plants. When you're feeding your fish or when you're fertilizing, take those extra 10 seconds. Just pan your tank, look at each of your plants. Does everything look okay? Keep doing what you're doing. Is there something different than what you expect? Consult your charts, figure out your problem, work from there. Some plants love one nutrient. This usually takes a long time to figure this out. The most obvious one, I've mentioned it several times, is Java fern. Java fern is a potassium hound. It will go hog wild on potassium in your tank, and that's the way you actually can get it looking amazing. And for those who typically suffer with Java ferns of any form, it's usually because they don't have enough potassium. Not always, but sometimes. Monte Carlo, I mentioned earlier, it's a calcium hog. Crips, all of them, whether they're red or not, they love iron. There's little dumb things like this. You'll learn those over time. Don't worry about mastering them now. See a deficiency, treat it the dumb way. Use your reference materials. They're your best friend. It's like when you study in school, right? When you study for a test, if they let you take notes to that test gets way easier, doesn't it? Keep your notes handy. They're your best friends. And even, so one of the things I do is like some people will do journals when they're setting up new tanks and watching all their testing results and trying to figure out when their tank's ready for fish. You can keep the same journal from when you encounter problems with plants and reference those notes. They will help you. Make references, make your life easier. Adapt fertilization to your water. Like I said earlier, if you're in a well and you actually have nitrates in your water, or maybe you're one of the places that has a natural small amount of ammonia in your water, you might not necessarily need to dose an all-in-one. You might only need to go with something like your micronutrients, or something like a fluorine multi from Brightwell as an example, which is micros plus potassium, because potassium is like impossible to get in your water. If you naturally have really high amounts of calcium, you probably don't need to ever worry about a calcium additive. Even if you see like what is the typical calcium deficiency occur, if you know you have lots of calcium in your water, look at the other things that can cause that problem with those deficiency charts and rule out the first one because you know you have calcium in your water. Like, make things easy on yourself. Don't fight your water. Make it simple. Same thing, adapt your lights. If you have lots of high demand stems, you need high light. If you have lots of Anubias and Java fern, you need low light. Don't have super bright light on these plants. You will get algae. They just don't need that much light. You tailor your lights to your plants. In the end, it is all about the plants in the tank. And finally, balance is always hard. Even the most seasoned aquarist, the people who have like botany degrees and do this stuff, run into problems. It's a consistently changing game. You can get a tank rock solid for a year and a half. And then all of a sudden, your water company is doing a flush and all sorts of extra minerals end up in your water system for a few weeks. And bam, every tank in your house has a green hair algae outbreak. Ask me how I know about this. That was one very panicked period of my life 5 years ago until I figured out that, oh, my water company flushes out the pipes twice a year. So when I get to these 2 periods of the year, chill out on fertilizer for like a week. Just stop. There's going to be extra nutrients in the water. Let the plants chew those things up so that there's not too much excess stuff. And now algae can't all of a sudden take over. When problems happen. I've kind of talked about this briefly, so I'll kind of speed this part up. Almost all your immersed growing plants, anything you buy out of a store, 90% of the time they come fresh from a farm and they haven't converted fully. So when you see them start to look like it's dying, shedding off of its leaves. I did this a lot. My first tank, I went through, I think it was like 7 different batches of plants because I saw leaves falling off and assumed they were dead. The lesson I learned, like the dumb way, is reach in and feel the stem or feel the plant. Because if it doesn't feel like complete mush, it's just getting rid of the immersed grown growth and it's converting over to submerged. Give it time. Don't panic right away. Usually the top of the stem will start growing new stuff if it's a stem. In the cases of most of your like Anubiases, Java ferns, your epiphytes, or your root growth, you might see crypts melt every single leaf off. The roots are fine. Put a little nutrition at the roots, wait a couple weeks, and all of a sudden you'll start seeing this little field of tiny green leaves. And then all of a sudden, a few weeks later, you've got a bunch of baby little crypts. A few months later, you've got a forest that looks incredible and it's everything you dreamed of. Don't panic right away. Plants are pretty robust. Give them time. Assess the plant state. Daily when I'm looking at my tanks, I do a quick scan. I just look at all my plants. I just assess their state. Everything looks good here, good here. Why is that melting back? Right? It's a fast, quick thing, and I can quickly go, something's wrong here, come back after I've done every other tank, take a few extra minutes, try to figure out, look at my charts, what's going wrong, how can I adjust and fix it? CO2 speeds up all these processes. Makes conversion faster, makes growth faster. It also makes your deficiencies show faster because it's chewing through more stuff, so if it's deficient, the problems happen quicker. So if you're on CO2 and you start seeing the telltales of a problem, don't wait too long because with that CO2, those deficiencies become bigger problems much faster. Even at low amounts, it happens quicker. So just be on the lookout if you're using CO2 in a bunch of your tanks. Algae is just normal. You will always get some semblance of algae in an aquarium. It is a simple organism. A touch of like dust algae on a rock or some wood, even a little bit on your glass, don't stress. Those perfectly maintained, no algae on them tanks ever, it's because they have entire paid maintenance crews to go in there with toothbrushes to keep these things clean. It's an unrealistic standard that you'll never do in actual nature, unless you want to be in your tank a couple days a week with a toothbrush. And then yes, you too can have that perfectly clear tank where it doesn't even look like it has water in it. I don't have that kind of time, so I just know that as long as I don't see plants covered in hair algae, big tufts of blackbeard algae, just little dust algae, it's okay. You can use cleanup crews to help you with that and keep it a little in check so it doesn't get too crazy. Don't stress about that stuff. Algae is normal. It's only when it gets outside of what we see normally that we then need to start thinking, okay, how can I fight this? Stems and epiphytes, it's kind of a light versus fertilizer thing. So in the case of like stems, they typically like more fertilizer, more light because they grow more aggressively. Epiphytes, less fertilizer, less light. It's very simple. But this is, again, think about the plants in your tank. Yeah, go ahead.
What's an example of an epiphyte?
Sure. So any of the ones that attach to wood or rock, those are epiphytes. My apologies. Should have defined that better. So Java fern, bulbitis, anubias, boos. There's a few weird ones. And then you can kind of consider mosses like epiphytes because they function similar even though they technically are a different category of plant. But their function is the same.
All the plants that I have.
Well,
I don't have stem plants.
then I love epiphytes because they're simple. They're easy, and diagnosing their problems is usually relatively fast. And they look awesome. They look more natural, right? You jab some Java fern into a crevice in your wood, and then it grows out over time and takes over that piece of wood and log, and you're like, that does look like a tree that fell into a river, doesn't it? Right? I love that stuff. That's absolutely my jam. But there's so many other things too that are really fun. Root feeding plants. Hey, root tabs. If you have a root feeding plant that's having a problem, no matter what the problem is, jam a root tab under it. Get an all-in-one root tab, just plug that bad boy in there and wait a couple weeks, it'll probably recover. Unless you trick yourself into thinking it has a problem because you see holes in the leaves, and you're this guy, and you put plecos in with Amazon swords. Plecos and Amazon swords are enemies and best friends. Plecos love Amazon swords because they're delicious. Amazon swords hate plecos because they eat them. So if you want to have robust, beautiful sword plants, don't put your plecos in with them. But other than that, if you see a problem in any given root feeder, seriously, just jam a root tab under it. You don't even really need to assess it. Shove a root tab in there and walk away. 2 weeks later, it'll probably be fine. Yes?
Apparently, the Osmocote DIY root tab, what do you think?
Oh, Osmocote DIY. Oh, well, I thought I had that in here. I might. I personally do not like them. I've seen enough horror stories to walk away from them. And the reason is simple. Osmocote by nature has ammonia in it. All of our aquatically designed root tabs do not have ammonia in them. They'll have mineralized clay, like 50% of those things is mineralized clay, then some nutrient powders. That's how almost all of them are built, with some very rare exceptions. That's simple. And depending on your substrate, there is a risk by jamming excess ammonia down into the substrate that it can, if you're in like an aqua soil, get into the water column and spike your ammonia and cause problems in your fish. Now, if you're responsible, and you only do your root tabs so often, and you don't jam like 70 root tabs into your tank on a 20 gallon, you're probably not going to run into problems, and it can be a good way to save money. I, as someone who lives his life testing products for a living and looking at how ways can go absolutely horribly wrong, and that's my default scenario, right, is what's the worst that can happen? I typically avoid those things because deep down my natural professional paranoia kicks in too hard, and I love my babies too much. And my poor rainbows are dumb, and when I try to put root tabs in, they think it's food. So very frequently, I'm fighting off several 4, 5, 6-inch fish trying to get that silly thing out of my tongs, because clearly that's that frozen Daphnia they got last week. I can't tell you the number of times I have been trying to pull a root tab out of a rainbow fish's mouth. Because it's more than once. So I inherently stay away from it because otherwise I've got to sometime film it and turn it into a comedy, right? Medium and higher light can help with converting a little faster, but during that conversion process, your plants are consuming less nutrients, so medium and higher light can cause more algae. So, if you're choosing not to use CO2, don't push your light way up. Bring your light down a little bit and just have a little extra patience. But if you're using CO2, you can have a little bit higher light to help that process go a bit faster because, again, you're giving it CO2, you're giving it carbon, it can consume more, it speeds those processes up. And finally, don't be afraid to test your water. Even if you think you've got it down pat, you probably don't. So test your water because you might see, oh, it seems like all my plants are looking good, except that one little anubias, but you know, it's shaded out and there's these more aggressive growers. You might find out that those aggressive growers are eating every ounce of nitrate in your tank, and when you test it, you have 0 nitrates when you thought you might have had 10, right? Don't be afraid to test, especially as you're first getting a tank going and you're going through conversion processes. Test a lot. It helps inform you, helps you realize like, oh, I guess dosing nutrients every other day isn't quite enough right now, or is too much right now. You might think it's right because the math tells you it's good, and then you'll find out, oh, geez, I'm at 50 ppm nitrate. I got to dial that bad boy back. I'm going to get algae in no time if I keep this up, right? Test, it's your friend. In the front, go ahead.
Do you have a favorite substrate that you?
I'll cover substrate in just a second. That might answer your question. Okay, go ahead.
For testing.
Yes.
Is there like an additional testing that you do other than the standard nitrate, ammonia?
I will also break out GH and KH tests. I like just paying attention to my hardness ratings.
Okay. But there's not.
I'm not trying to test for like individual calcium, individual iron. You really don't need that. Usually if you have the other things in check, get the big problems. It's kind of like the where there's smoke, there's fire mentality. Get the smoke out of the way first, and then you can dial into the bigger details and worry about those. But usually you really don't need to test for them. Up front?
In both your slides, you have more reddish or red plants than.
That's just because they're pretty.
I understand. My question is about light.
Yeah.
Or any other particular needs?
In the sense of like for red plants?
Yes. Are they any different than what preferences or?
In stems, they typically want more intense light to get the reds. There's some other like crazy tricks you can do, like making them nitrate deficient to intensify their red color. I don't do any of that nonsense because it's way more work than you actually need. However, there are several red plants that basically don't care about how much light you have. They'll stay the same until you start giving them CO2. So an example would be like Ludwigia repens. It's a super common plant, grows natively in the United States. The underside of that leaf will always be red if it's healthy. Low light, high light, as long as you're not gassing it, it's always going to be like that. So it doesn't matter. Your red crypts, the amount of light doesn't matter. It almost never matters. The only crypt that really cares about light is stupid pink flamingo. And that's because it's a genetic deformity and it is all sorts of horrible. But it looks interesting because it looks fake. And sometimes we like fake real plants. Or is it a real fake plant? Yeah, I never know how to get that one right. Go ahead.
So, barring a conversation about fish and nitrates,
Yes.
if you're talking plants only, is there an upper level for any of those nutrients that your plants are going to be like, oh, okay, it's time to die. This is just too much of something I can't.
Sure. Typically, that would get to a point of where it would negatively impact your fish.
Well, I'm just saying, if there's no fish in the tank,
Yeah.
what nutrient are you talking about? Is it
Nitrate.
nitrates?
Nitrate, almost always.
So what kind of numbers do nitrates have to get to affect the plants?
Typically over about 100 parts per million.
That's it.
Yeah, it can get pretty high. I prefer to keep mine in the 10 to 20 range. I like to keep it lean, which, like I've mentioned this a couple times, I like a lean, consistent dose. Some people like 20 to 40. Basically anything between 10 and 40, you should be fine unless you have super high demand plants. Then you probably want to be in that 20 to 40 range. So a lot of your like rotalas is a big example there. Rotalas consume nitrates like crazy. Most of your floaters suck up nitrates like it's nobody's business. So if you like really healthy floating plants, slightly higher nitrates is going to get you there. Go ahead.
I can't relate, I apologize. Have you already spoken about snails and
Not really. The simple answer to that is this. Most of your snails will actually only eat decaying plant matter. They don't eat healthy plant matter. I like snails in my tanks, including the dreaded Malaysian trumpet snail, because Malaysian trumpet snails will go into your substrate, shift stuff around and aerate it so that I'm less likely to run in some of the negative pockets that can occur with like deep sand, as an example. That's at least the most common, where you get like those gaseous pockets that are actually dangerous for your fish. Also, they go in and they process a lot of your mulm from your fish, and they break it down even further to make it more easily available to the plants. So most people who dread Malaysian trumpet snails, I love them. They do nature's work for me. They let me be lazy. And I love being lazy because I have too many things to do often in a given day. But if you're worried about snails, there's several ways to deal with them. I'm just probably not going to cover them in this chat. I want you to cheat the system. I'm a tester. My job is to exploit things for a living. So I built this. Cheat. Boost your growth with CO2. It's a little more expensive, but man, does it make life easier. You want this beautiful, dense field of like Pogostemon erectus? Do you know how you do that? Tiny amount of CO2. 2 bubbles a second in a 40-gallon breeder. That can be 1/3 of your tank. And it looks awesome. And tetras look incredible in it. Hack. Usually a bad word, right? We hate hackers, except with a Planet tank. Design your system based on the plants you use. If you are putting in mostly stems and epiphytes, you don't need that fancy ADA substrate. If you're doing all root feeding plants, you probably don't want 6 inches of sand because you're going to choke the roots out and they're going to struggle to do really, really well. Do you need the fanciest substrate all the time? Nope. Does it help to have something slightly nicer than just the hot pink gravel? Yes. But there are ways that we can design things around that. Like if we know we want, I like that kind of pebbly riverstone look. Perfect. I want to have lots of crypts. Root tabs solves your problems for you. Put root tabs down in the substrate, make that nutrition available, because that gravel is not going to pull it out of the water column for you. Or put a thin layer of aqua soil down underneath it, cap it with that nice pretty gravel. Bam. Problem solved, right? We can adapt our fertilizers, we can adapt our light, we can adapt our substrate to the tank that we're putting together. Design your system based on the plants. Life gets a lot easier. Avoid. Don't get attached to just one solution. My example here would be simple. You could go online. You could find some weird, crazy person from Seattle telling you that the Fluval 3.0 plant light is the best bang for your buck known to man. But if you are mostly low light plants, you don't need that stupidly powerful light. You can get a simpler light. You don't need that nonsense. Or you might hear somebody tell you, oh no, XYZ is a total waste of money. Get this light instead, but then it doesn't have any dimming control. And when you have algae problems, now you've taken away one of your best weapons to fight algae when it comes to light issues. Even if I tell you that X is my favorite thing, it doesn't mean it's perfect for you. Remember, your water and mine is different. Your plant selection and mine might be different. Tailor those things. Avoid the, this is the best. Just find the thing that does what you need it to do. And similarly, could be something like this. You might read on the internet, oh, the best way to get rid of cyanobacteria, erythromycin, right? It's a bacteria, that stupid blue-green algae. Dose erythromycin. That's going to fix your problem. That's a solution. There's 11 ways to solve every problem. There might even be 100 ways to solve a problem. Just because one solution is what somebody tells you, if it doesn't work for you, don't get attached to thinking that you're the problem. We can find other solutions. There's always a different way to fix the problem or fight the thing or make something successful. Just because I love aqua soil doesn't mean you have to use aqua soil in all of your tanks. You can use all sorts of stuff. Even that dreaded hot pink gravel that I hate and I talk about all the time. You can have that hot pink gravel in there for your kid, and you just tuck some root tabs in that bad boy, and you can have root feeding plants do well. Stems, they don't care. They feed off the water column. As long as there's nutrients in the water, they don't care what the heck the substrate is as long as it holds them in place. Don't get attached to one solution. Exchange. If you have plants that are starting to struggle, but you have parts of the growth that are still healthy, the usual example of this is like the lower part of my plant, all the leaves are dying off and it's just a bare stem, but the top is super healthy. Trim the bottom part off, replant the healthy part. Get rid of all the things that are having problems. Let that plant reset. Similarly, if you're doing really amazing with Bucephalandra, but you can't get a Nubius to work for you to save your soul, just switch to Bus. Put Buses instead of, they're a similar plant. Put them in there. Are you really good with Ludwigia, but every Rotala you put in just dies? Okay, try more Ludwigias. There's like 100 of them. Go nuts. You'll find something that gives you something similar, whether it's a leaf texture, a color, whatever it may be. Don't be afraid to exchange things out to get something similar that will be successful. Finally, test. If somebody tells you this plant can only be kept this way, but you really want to try that plant, try it. Don't be afraid. Plants are easy to replace, and as long as you're not going super crazy and buying like that thingamajig that was only collected once in 2009 and there's only 5 people in the United States that have it, as long as you're not spending like $200 on a plant, like if you're buying a bundle of, I've never seen that plant before, it looks cool, it's $5. Try it. Try it out. You might find your new favorite plant. You might also find that one plant that you can grow like it's nobody's business. Send those clippings to your club, trade them at a swap, get a table at the Clash, sell those bad boys off, and fund your addiction just like I do. Balance is never once and done. It is continuous. It is every day. It is every week. For as long as we keep a tank, balance is always shifting slightly. Things will happen, and when they happen, don't panic. Just think about these things. As plant density increases, requirements increase. It's just like if you add 50% more fish, you need 50% more food. If your plant started at 1 inch tall and there was only 5 stems, and now you have 50 stems that are 6 inches tall, that's a lot more matter. It needs more fertilizer, right? You're always kind of adjusting, making changes. Big trims. If you trim like your entire tank in one go, you've reset your tank in one go. Now it has to regrow in all these places. And if you're still dosing the same amount of fertilizer when it was packed to the gills and your fish could barely swim, you're going to get out of balance faster. You're going to get algae. So when you do big trims, dial back that fertilizer for a little bit until you start seeing that new growth come back in. Then start dialing it back up. Be patient. When you encounter problems, if you get algae outbreak, don't change your light, your fertilizer, and this all at the same time. Change one thing. Observe for a couple weeks. Algae's ugly, but if we fight it slow, we can get rid of it long term. Don't try to make 7 changes at once. Just make one change and observe for a week or 2. Then come back and go, okay, what's the next little thing I can tinker with? Same thing goes for like, if you try a plant and you're trying a fertilizer method one way, then you realize, I don't have quite enough of this. Make a small adjustment. Add just a touch more of something. Keep seeing how that works for the next couple weeks, whether it's your testing, whatever. Make small changes. It makes it easier to get yourself not completely out of whack more and more and more. Algae's always going to happen. You're going to find it. You're going to have an outbreak every once in a while. You're going to have dust algae somewhere. You're going to have that one strand of frickin' staghorn that refuses to come off that one dumb leaf, and eventually you'll get frustrated and rip that leaf out. That was me last week. I've been fighting one little chunk of staghorn in one tank for 3 months. And I finally got it down to only one leaf in the entire tank, and I just finally went, problem solved. It's gone. But I'll keep watching it, right? Don't be afraid. Algae's going to happen, and as long as we just take our time and slowly make adjustments, we can fight it and make it minimal or practically non-existent long-term. Plants, they're resilient. Plants are tough. It's like most of our fish. Our fish are way tougher than we give them credit for. Similar to why I said don't make 100 changes at once, just be patient. Give them time when you make those adjustments. They'll find their way. A lot of your plants, especially if they were pretty robust to start, they're not just going to melt overnight. This isn't salt water where you can lose, $7,000 of coral in 24 hours. Plants are pretty tough. Constant growth, healthy sign. If your plants are always growing, your tank is pretty healthy. Just because one plant might be struggling doesn't mean that all plants are struggling. Don't panic too much. Keep it patient, slow changes. Finally, never be afraid to tinker. Nature changes constantly, and nature is pretty damn good at doing its job. Just because I have a light setting that I love to death doesn't mean that you'll love it exactly the same way. Tinker with it. Just because I like doing fertilizer one way, if you start trying it and you go, you know what, I'm running into this. Tinker it, play with it, find what works best for your tank. What kind of final thoughts? Or as you'll notice, I say how to get paid. I love acronyms and dumb puns. I'm basically just a walking dad joke. Patience. You will mess up. No matter how long you've done this, you will find that one plant that refuses to work with you. Monte Carlo for me. Ludwigia tornado for me. I can't keep those to save my soul. I have tried more times than I would like to fully admit. And yet, I will keep being patient and I will keep trying. Adjust. Do things based on your schedule and your tank. If you want to see before I go to work and after I go to work, and I don't want to make it complicated and have all this nonsense going on while I'm at work, make an adjustment. Add that siesta in your light. Do that thing. If you can't fertilize every single day, because maybe the way that your schedule works, like you're a firefighter and you're on the job for like 3 days straight, that's okay. Adjust things to your schedule. Your plants will adjust to. It's okay. Insight. Watch your plants. They will tell you everything you need to know. Once you get those signs, go look at your charts, then start addressing them. But address them one at a time, slowly. And finally, do. Try things. Mess with stuff. Tinker. Have fun. This is supposed to be a hobby. Don't get committed to something because some dumb on the internet from Seattle told you that's the way he does it. Your way can be different than my way, and we can both find success. That's the wonderful part about this hobby. I can talk to somebody who's kept the same plant, and we've kept it 10 different ways. We've done things that people said you can't possibly do. You cannot possibly have that soft water plant without CO2 and low light. I've done a few of those. They don't look great, but they're alive and they keep growing. Their color just sucks. You can get all these kind of things. There are things you can do, but if you want that, here's a great example. Big diversity of plants in one of my plant grow out tanks when I used to grow tons of plants and sell them really regularly when I had more time. This beautiful nonsense that you're seeing right here is a single 40-gallon breeder on 2 bubbles a second CO2, 1 pump of an all-in-one fertilizer a day. That's it. And it has Eco-Complete and a little bit of flue ball stratum. Only to help make sure I have good root systems, and because I don't like the look of sand, sorry for you cichlid people. I like rainbows, we like dark substrate. It's just the way we live. Gonna have to deal with that with me, I'm sorry. But does any of those things that I just described sound complicated? Little touch of CO2, a little bit of fertilizer, simple tank, basic substrate. That. It's just time and patience. And you two can be a psycho like me and go into your club meetings like some kind of drug addict looking for your next fix, looking for that next plant, that thing you can't find, that thing you haven't tried, that thing that you refuse to give up on, Monte Carlo. You too can be like me and be a psycho about plants, because if you thought I was crazy about rainbowfish yesterday, I am even more crazy about plants. Thank you very much. Now, I have questions for you. I come equipped with prizes. And I have questions. So, I displayed a graph earlier. Who can tell me?
79%.
See, you didn't even ask a question. Carbon. Root tabs. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Now, who can tell me the dumb movie that the graphic on that same thing came from? I'll get you two. You were pretty close. Okay. You want some tube effects? Yeah, see, I have more than one prize. Don't worry, I got more, but it's all fish food. You're just going to have to deal with fish food. You all have fish, right? Yeah, you get really hungry. It's kind of like a snack.
Is Corey a good friend of yours over in
Is Corey a good friend of mine? Yeah, right now, I think the most we've talked is like twice in the last 2.5 years. He just happens to be the fish store I like the most that is near me. I've just been a customer of his for a long time. But we talk occasionally, and when we do, it's very cordial. So, he's a friendly guy. You guys have all probably met him at this point. He goes to a ton of stuff. Okay. Now, CO2. Very important. We talked about 79% carbon earlier. Do you need it?
No.
Everybody, good. Now here's the fun part. In a 40-gallon breeder. He's fast. He's fast. All right.
Technical, do need it. You don't need to add it.
Yes, you definitely need it, but you're going to get it naturally through gas exchange and respiration from your fish. And water changes. That's going to bring CO2. Okay, my last question. This one might be hard. When did I achieve Master 10?
2016?
No. No.
2018,
2021.